It ain't complicated, you know, man. It's like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Luthemplar, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Hello, once again.
So I'm going to kind of speed through this because we're covering quite a lot of material here. Yes. So before we get into it, could you just describe kind of like who you are and how you ended up here?
I am Luthemplar, previously known as Cringewalker. I bumped into this space, I guess through Sargon. AA was on a show. AA did a Star Wars Empire Did Nothing Wrong meme video. Named myself Cringewalker as a result of that. Decided that's not a brand name that can be very popular, so Luthemplar is a better name. Kind of a merger of Luther and Templar, although I would probably call myself a Catholic who likes Luther these days. But anyway. That's a little quick intro. I primarily showed up in Lambda's Bible studies last year.
Well, in addition to that, you're also the main creative behind the Restoration Bureau, correct? So can you describe what that is?
Yes, I am the director of the Restoration Bureau. No, it's like AI art started showing up, and I was like, hey, this is a tool. I'm not gonna just like be a cheapo and just generate art. But I viewed it as a way of rapidly producing propaganda, and I saw a lack of positive vision in the right wing this past 2 years, and a lot of discussions on what that would look like. So I thought, why don't I just like try to get the best catchphrases, riddles, rhymes, witticisms? Like, how can I make something that's like, 2 sentences that each rhyme with each other, that like kind of get a short, simple point about the dissident right that can be popularly consumed, like the opposite of a leftist meme. Seems to have been popular. I'm going to keep doing it. My goal is to do one piece a day for a year, and so far so good.
Yeah, it's really good work. I've been impressed, and obviously you put a lot of work into it, but I would kind of describe it for the people who haven't encountered it, and it's linked down in the description if you guys want to check it out. It's kind of like, I don't mean to say propaganda in a negative sense, but kind of like propaganda for our guys.
Yeah.
So you can, in addition to just like appreciating it and looking at it, I think that you sold prints as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, everybody wanted me to sell prints, and I'm struggling to find the time to manage the shop. I'm gonna add more. Try to do one for Christmas. Some people got some stuff on time, some people didn't. Sorry. But yeah, people like it. I guess it's people are putting up on their walls to encourage them on the day. I feel very happy about that. It's this little thing that reminds you that what you see on the TV is a bunch of BS. Remember your foundations, remember your roots. You come from a great people and a great religion and a great history.
Well, I think that's a really noble goal. But we're not here to talk about your important creative work. We're actually here because you, for months on end, successfully badgered me into reading a particularly, I guess, like influential work. So do you want to introduce our topic?
Yeah, after I read it over the summer, a little bit earlier in March, I wanted to get a lot of people I know in these circles to read it. It's it's officially called The Remembrance of Earth's Past, but it's typically known as the Three Body Trilogy. This is it's not actually a trilogy. There's a prequel and a post-sequel, if you will, but it's Shesheng Ling's sci-fi trilogy he wrote in the early 2000s, vaguely inspired by Asimov and a few other famous writers from the last century. In many ways, it's kind of like the introduction to pseudo-traditional Chinese science fiction, or revamp for the modern age. I found it really interesting in its criticisms of essentially democracy. It has a few valid criticisms of Western thinking, a few criticisms of Eastern thinking, which is surprising for them to write something that's like self-critical. I don't know how he got some of this stuff published in China. It does get kind of critical of some of the standard Chinese propaganda, but it is a thinker. It makes you think, and if you like it like me, you'll end up really getting paranoid of the night sky. I'll say that.
So here's my take on it, because what I want to do is kind of a general overview of the book. And I should say at the very beginning, you guys should all go read these books. They're worth your time. You can find free audiobooks if you're illiterate. I actually already owned all of them. I'd read the first one when it first was translated and never transitioned to the rest of the series. I was in high school. It was a bad decision because there's a lot in these books. They're really worth your time. And like I've discussed, with other guests, that there's a lot in sci-fi that you can take from it. This idea of kind of like exploring extreme human conditions through sci-fi is something I find really interesting. And I will also say, in addition to being, an interesting thought exercise, this is also probably in the top 5 to 10% as far as literary skill goes, ranked against other sci-fi. There's a lot of sci-fi that's pretty mathematically written. This is actually like quite a fun book to read. It's quite well written and in many places kind of poetic. So in all cases, I consider this a hearty recommend. If you do care about, spoilers, if you do care about plot points, you should probably, sit this one out, go read the book, and then come back to it. Because this is a good thing to go into with kind of fresh eyes, so to speak.
Yeah, we'll try to avoid some of the big spoilers because it's worth reading and getting the shock value out of it. We'll try to, I believe Jay Burden said from the outward in, so avoiding the major key spoilers and touching more on the tangential consequential topics, maybe.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. So I will say kind of my first initial thoughts on this, because the first book, The Three-Body Problem, is introduced in an opener that I really like, where essentially we are following, one of the main characters of the first book as she and her father go through the Chinese Cultural Revolution, right? Her father is an academic and ends up being killed. And kind of like the hook of the book, so to speak, the inciting event of the story is, her being sent out on what essentially is like a penal legion for, academics, right?
Yeah. and that's the cool thing, because like she's kind of like, I would argue a lot of the male readers in here are going to relate to her. Let's be frank, she's a femcel.
Yeah, pretty much, right? And so my point in bringing that up is, in addition to being just something I had not read about, especially when I first came across the book in probably 2014, 2015, but this book is truly Chinese in the sense that not only the events, how they're discussed and how the characters interact is fundamentally Chinese. It is not American. And when you see Americans in the book, because they're Americans, or in essentially every part of the story, it's kind of a funny mirror to see your culture reflected back, right? Like every American is essentially, like an exaggerated, like Ramboized version. And I liked reading something that was truly, it was both modern and of its culture. There was no sense of homogenization in it.
I'd also say it's not mocking of Americans. It does emphasize a lot of our qualities as a people, as a culture. We said Rambo American because like a lot of them you get that vibe, but they're not dumb people. They're not like uneducated people. And by the end of the book, like one of the main characters, an American, is essentially providing the solution to the problem, and the Chinese character who's the protagonist is just ignoring him. And so it is very and this is, I'll say, this is actually to Lu Shixing's style of writing. The Three-Body Trilogy there is basically a prequel called Ball Lightning, which takes place a few years before Three-Body Problem, and involves a war between China and America, and essentially like coming to an armistice condition. It's a decent book, and it kind of sets the universe up. Some of the characters show up in later books, but it is in many ways independent. But Lu Shixing cares about showing the Americans as like, this is how they like. It's not a thing to be mocked. It's just it's a different beast. He views Americans as this. They're not Chinese. They're a different beast.
Right, and that's why, in many ways, this book is profoundly anti-liberal, because in almost every sci-fi setting, even the quote-unquote based sci-fi settings, humans are kind of taken as a kind of like a true blank slate, right? Like every human is interchangeable. Pick your the sci-fi universe of your choice. But in this one, even in kind of like the far future, there are cultural differences. There are strong cultural differences. At multiple points across several thousand pages, human civilization essentially expands to by orders of magnitude, right?
Yeah.
And in each one of these, we still see cultural differences, right? Humanity doesn't become truly homogenized, which I think is interesting because it's kind of a buried premise in a lot of science fiction, that essentially like, oh, humans will just become essentially an interchangeable piece. And I like that that is something that the author doesn't indulge in.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked is that when we do get into the future, there is no united Earth like navy. There are regional space navies that carry on the nature of the nations that built them and funded them, but still retain a distinct quality of where they come from. Like there's like the North American fleet, the Asian Pacific fleet, and the European fleet, and these are distinct great cultures that have their own fleet tactics, their own like ship designs, their own nature to them. And even the way the crews interact with each other retain a lot of familiar traits of what it was like, oh, what's a distinct nature in like Chinese naval tradition or American naval tradition, or more accurately Anglo-Saxon naval tradition. The book is very respectful to like these rich traditions we've built as cultures that they can't really homogenize their fine-tuned weapons that we've each developed by our own origin myth, basically.
Right. And I want to get into, like the specific events of the book a little bit. I know that I've, fully warned people that if they're interested, they should tune out. But one of the other things, and this is in addition to kind of like the recognition of the difference in humans, is additionally that gender roles are kind of a recurring theme throughout this entire series. That there's this there is a difference between men and women. And later in the book, when, kind of throughout the second and third book, the humanity's discovery of, kind of like hibernation technology is a major plot device. Essentially, you can go to a facility, essentially freeze yourself for as much time as you want and then pop back out. And what happens is that what the author describes these kind of eras of feminized men,
Yeah.
right? where with increased levels of technology, the need for physical violence, the need for physical work goes away, and men essentially become more feminized. And so there are multiple places in which there's a contrast between old and new men, right? Where the old men are described as kind of like brooding and, bulky and violent compared to their more kind of like effeminate and effete counterparts. And there are multiple points in time in which essentially feminized men cannot rise to the challenges presented by, I guess, like the plot of these books.
Yeah.
And in addition to, being kind of like anti-feminization of men, this book is also not particularly kind towards women.
Yeah, as is Chinese tradition.
Right, which is a pretty common, like if you read normal people review these books, that's something that comes up quite a lot.
Yeah, like the book does not apologize for presenting women as being too loving and too trusting. And again, once again, it's never in a mocking way. It's like, yeah, that like your role is to be the mother, and of course, if you're leading the country as a mother, you might get fooled for those who aren't very motherly.
Right, and that's something that I think rings true in this, is that, kind of being outside of, whatever this kind of like religion of, human equality is, you can see truths that kind of everyone knew until yesterday in the West. And it's very refreshing to get a perspective, outside of that kind of like bubble of homogeneity, that there is a place in which, the author's like, well, okay, obviously you need women, women, these instincts are there for a reason, but they're not always useful. It's not like kind of a lot of, and this is, something you can find in, all sorts of modern fiction, where essentially the buried message is that if you just adopt, feminine attitudes towards the world and feminine attitudes towards conflict resolution, well, that's how you win. In this book, in this series, like you do have to be, kind of ruthless and hard and masculine to win.
Yeah, I and it's really cool because at one point when Baizhao, the guy, the 21st century admiral who goes forward 200 years, when he takes over the natural selection ship, the female admiral, the officers on the ship who are female, they're not used to what they call like a real man, like, and some of them get a certain kind of like fatherly respect for this old guy. And again, it's very respectful. It's not like, oh, she's gonna fall in love for like the masculine man. No, it's more of like this generation has no fathers, and this woman sees in this old admiral a father figure who she like instinctively knows to trust and like follow, basically. So it's not all like, muscular man saves the day. It's also like these people are father figures. They're patriarchs. They restore that certain strong spine of society.
All right, so we've officially ended the general themes discussion, right? We're gonna enter the actual like description of the plot now. So you're warned. You should read these books. There's a lot in them, but at this point, we will not care for spoilers, right? So the first book, The Three-Body Problem, essentially takes place in kind of in time periods between the 1960s and kind of the near future, right? So as I said before, it starts off in the Cultural Revolution, and for much of it kind of follows a collection of scientists, right? And the inciting event that sets the whole series off in motion is that this female scientist, right, this femcell.
Wenji.
That's the other problem, is that I cannot say Chinese names. And
I will try my best.
Remember every single character by their initials because that's easier than saying their Chinese name. Wenji. Right. Nonetheless, right, after she kind of redeems herself from kind of the social pariah status as an academic during the Cultural Revolution, she's essentially stuck at the Chinese version of SETI, right? Which is this radio installation, which is designed to do a combination of essentially like interstellar research and monitoring American satellites. And while she's there, she essentially makes first contact with an alien civilization, right? And the first contact is made when she discovers that, just for fun, essentially by random chance, she blasts radiation at the sun. And this acts as kind of a repeater, right? It expands this signal out to the galaxy.
She happens to fire the signal at the right angle that the sun's radio waves amplify the human radio waves, and it happens to blast many thousands of times louder than it should ordinarily.
Right, exactly. And so a few years later, after the signal has time to travel, it reaches another civilization. Right, the civilization is known as Trisolarian, called Trisolarian because there are 3 suns.
Yeah, you may not have picked up, but it's actually Alpha Centauri. It's the nearest star system to here.
And so the reason that the three-body problem is so named is that there's this idea, this thought problem in physics, which essentially says that you can predict how one planet will orbit rather a body larger than it. You can kind of predict how it will orbit 2 different bodies. That's mathematically predictable. But if there are 3 bodies, it is completely unpredictable. It's effectively random. And so for a planet orbiting around 3 suns, this means that the temperature and the tides of this planet are completely unpredictable. And so what happens is that when, our shall we say, I guess technically one of the main characters of this first book hears back, she's contacted another character or another creature on this world who is essentially doing the same job she is, monitoring the sky, looking for other signs of life. And this alien writes back, and I want to just complete this for the sake of discussion, and basically says, "Don't ever talk to us again. We will kill you. Like my civilization, if we hear from you again, we're going to know where you are, and we will come kill you and take your stuff." Essentially, because their planet is so unpredictable, it is so hostile to life, that their one purpose as a civilization is to find some place where they can have access to, a regular climate and access to, regular, seasons, because their entire civilization is continually reset by these kind of like unpredictable tides. And so what she does, and I just want to finish this, is she has been kind of so thoroughly abused by culture and so thoroughly kind of become so disgusted with humanity that she basically decides, I don't care. I want them to come and wipe out humanity. So that's kind of like the inciting event of the first book.
Sorry for interrupting. Because it does get kind of funny at moments. There are 2 points, maybe 3 points in those early like chapters. We'll say like this is like the first like probably it's not really the first third of the book. The layers are interlayered with things happening in the present day, so it kind of goes back and forth. But this is a really cool chapter because the alien in question is kind of like her foil. The alien as an individual is a pacifist, and this is why the alien goes by the name Listener. Shinjo, I forget his name. The author tends to generalize aliens, never really going too much into detail of what they are, who they are, but it gives them like these general names. And so this alien's name is named Listener, and Listener, he's a pacifist. He's like the opposite of a femcell, where like he looks at Earth's radio signal, a signal that was sent, because the signal that Ye Wenjie sent out was this like video footage of China's beautiful coasts and a bunch of like positive signals and everything. And the alien sees these beautiful trees along the Chinese coast and was like, I don't want that to be destroyed. We had our chance as civilization. We're stuck on this mess. Do we really want to spread this to that? And so in many ways, the Listener is like a liberal, essentially. He's a progressive liberal. He's a pacifist. He doesn't want to invade anyone. Of course, he's working for like a violent fascist government that wants to take your stuff. And so Listener gives the little warning to Ye Wenjie, hey, I don't know where this signal came from. You may not get this for many years, but if you ever respond to us, we'll know how far where you are. We will find you, and we're gonna take. We're from a shitty planet. The specific signal that they sent is like, do not reply, just over and over again, which is an interesting signal. Like, your first contact signal is basically don't reply. Like, I'm gonna leave you on read. Please stay on read. But yeah, Ye Wenjie, she's a femcell. Her dad got killed by the Chinese government. She hates the government. She hates everyone, which again is surprising this book got published. But essentially, this character, Ye Wenjie, is like, no, F this. I want this world to burn. Here's my coordinates. Here's my address. Come and do me dirty, basically.
Well, and it's interesting because a large catalyst and kind of the reason that she has come to hate humanity is her interaction with another character, Mike Evans. Yeah. Mike Evans is the first American we meet. And the best way to describe it is Mike Evans is essentially baby boomer Greta Thunberg. Yes. He's an oil, an heir to an oil fortune. And he has become so disgusted by, the human destruction of the environment that he essentially wishes, the destruction of all life on Earth. And so,
well, only human life, not all life.
Yeah. Sorry. Excuse me. Only human life. And so what happens, and I'm doing this in chronological order, not in kind of like the order of the plot, because we see this kind of like much like a sitcom, like an A plot and a B plot, right? Where you have the present day and the past kind of alternating and informing each other. Is that when this alien civilization receives her second message, when she basically says like, I don't care, come and take it. We're not worth saving. The first thing they do is just immediately they send off a fleet, and what essentially this gives us as a civilization, a 400-year ticking clock, right? It's going to take them 400 years to get here. But what's especially interesting is within a few years of setting off, they basically have this massive technological development. And we won't get into the details because it's both relatively complicated and not something we can summarize. But this is a major theme in the book. And this this magic, this kind of technology they discover is the ability to make essentially incredibly intelligent supercomputers, smaller than an atom, right? Through kind of like the folding of dimensions. And what this enables is it enables them to have essentially instant access to every single thing on Earth, right? This enables them to see what's going on almost anywhere on Earth. It enables them to hear anything. And it especially enables them to essentially put a hard cap on human technological advancement, right? The thought is, well, we don't want humans to develop weapons that can hurt us in the time between us launching our fleet and when we get there. And so what this creates is what I think one of the most interesting aspects of the book, which is the idea that technological development has an end. There is essentially a maximum cap we can reach. And so much of the drama of the first book is kind of revealing the situation in which humanity has essentially a 400-year doomsday clock and has no ability to develop technologically. So do you have anything to add to that, Luthemplar?
Yeah. You mentioned it a little bit, but like they launched the fleet first, realize, by the time the ships get there, Earth might be more advanced than us. Well, we might have just accidentally sent our best fleet to their doom. And then this like pipsqueak scientist on the alien world's like, not to worry, my like research project is in blowing up protons, and I think we can make a computer out of one of the protons. And essentially, like they the precepts, the like the governor general of some random territory of this alien world, it's always very vague when it comes to the aliens. It's like, well, let's do it, let's see what happens. And they eventually invent the Sofon, and because the Sofon is only the mass of a proton, it can actually travel at the speed of light, whereas the ships that are so massive, they can only travel at like 1% the speed of light. The ships that launch can only travel about 1%. Well, officially they can get to 10% the speed of light, but they can only accelerate 1% the speed of light, or something like that. And so it'll basically take them 400 years to get to Earth from a star system that's 4 light years away. However, the Sophons, as they're called, from the Greek "no," Sophon to the wisdom. So a proton, a Sophon, it's a wise proton. Funny word. But those things can travel at the speed of light due to their small mass, and thus they'll reach Earth in 4 years. And so, from essentially 4 years after the launch of the fleet, they can use these things to harass humanity and freeze up and corrupt scientific data at the microscopic scale. And of course, add in a little black magic, they're quantum entangled with the Sophon, with a matching Sophon on Trisolarian, so they can have faster than light technology communication, which may or may not be scientifically accurate, but whatever. At the time of the writing, I thought it was like, this is how we do FTL communications. And so essentially, the Sophons arrive at Earth 4 years after the launch of the fleet, and they just start harassing scientists and corrupting their data and like convincing scientists to kill themselves, essentially, to find some way to stall human science.
Well, in addition, what this also enables, the Trisolarian civilization to do is essentially foment a, kind of a traitor organization within Earth society. And this is headed up by Femcell and Mike Evans, our Greta Thunberg stand-in.
Yeah.
And what they essentially do is, and this is another interesting kind of critique of society, is they gather together this group of, essentially extremely upper class, high achieving malcontents, who for a variety of reasons essentially hate humans. They hate human life, either for environmental reasons, or they've become so disgusted with, kind of like the hoi polloi, that they have essentially, they have made the deal to end all life, end all human life, to prepare for kind of this, this alien civilization. And what's especially interesting is that what we see is that this kind of doomsday prophecy has become, in many of these people, essentially a religious conviction.
Yeah, they start calling the aliens the Lord and everything.
Right, exactly. That they have essentially turned this into a stand-in religion. And when I was talking to you about these books, because it took me a while to get through all three, because they are quite large, and there's 3 of them. I kind of said at multiple points, this book is simultaneously, based in cringe in equal parts. and the way that this book relates to religion is one of those examples, right? Which it has kind of like the obligatory, Chinese materialist atheist attitude towards religion. But at the same time, it does kind of get the idea that like these kind of like doomsday cult, this kind of like praising of the outside, this kind of like religion of the outsider is kind of like endemic to upper class liberals.
Yeah, and this is something because you kind of get the vibes that ETO, as they're known, the Earth Trisolarian Organization, they're basically progressives. They're like environmentalists. They're top-notch scientists who don't like the plebs. They're like the Carl Schwab. What's the guy's name?
Carl Schwab. No, Klaus Schwab.
Klaus Schwab. Like the everything we hate as like everything we hate on our side of the alley. And essentially, this is like the aliens provide a kind of like tangible god to these progressives that like, oh, this is how we progress. What's the ultimate end of progressivity or whatever you want to call it? It's the end of man, really. It's the end of biological man, and so they have different factions. Some of them think that humanity, what's left of them, like the best of humanity, might find a place in Trisolarian society, and then most of them are like, nah, humanity should be wiped out. Our world we don't deserve the world. Let the Trisolarians have Earth, and we'll go extinct willingly. The willing. It's a very anti-natalist organization.
Right, and so essentially the story of the first book really in many ways is kind of setting in motion the plot that will be continued, through the second and third.
Yeah.
And
sorry,
it's necessary. Oh, sorry, carry on, man.
I was just going to tie off the third book. The story ends with humanity discovering the ETO and thereby discovering the invasion. So humanity does not learn about the Trisolarians first. They learn about ETO first. The ETO is running this weird VR game that's recruiting like recluse and anti-natalist people. Like, why this organization with a giant boat recruiting these like progressives across the world? Why are scientists killing themselves after coming into contact with them? And essentially, like the UN's like, oh, we gotta figure out what these guys are up to do. Like, what's going on here? And then after having taken over their headquarters, the UN discovers this communication log between the ETO and something known as the Lord, and they discover that the Lord is actually an alien race that's been contacting them. And at the end of the book, the Sofons essentially reveal themselves to a UN conference meeting, because the Sofons have the ability to project text into the world. So essentially, they're they're not only little smart computers; they can like kind of present text by means of like unfolding their substrates or whatever, and displaying a text. And so at a UN meeting, the Sofons reveal themselves because now Earth knows about Trisolaris, and essentially just sends them a single message: "You're bugs." They just called humanity bugs, and then disappears. And with that, humanity is aware that there is an intelligence out there coming to get them. The logs show that they have about 400 years. And then Q book 2. What are we going to do to stop them?
Right, and I should also say that the climactic event is kind of like a strike on the main ETO vessel, where Boomer Greta Thunberg is killed, and it is revealed that Femcell is kind of the leading like operator of the Earth Trisolaris organization.
Yeah.
And so as we kind of pivot to the next book, where kind of humanity is thrown into chaos, basically they've been given this ticking clock. And a common theme in all of these is that there is the main character of the next book is kind of introduced in the one before it. And so essentially there's a minor character introduced in the second one who is basically has a conversation with Femcell about, kind of like what he is going to do with his life. And from this conversation, he develops what is called, and what is the exact term? Is it interstellar sociology?
Cosmic sociology.
Cosmic sociology, right? This essentially like useless academic, who describes himself as he doesn't particularly care. All he does is, hook up with women and do the bare minimum not to get fired. It is because of his pioneering work in this field of interstellar sociology is kind of an integral part of humanity's plan to kind of counter, this extraterrestrial force with essentially unlimited knowledge of what humans are doing. And so could you introduce kind of like the main plot device of the second book, which is, humanity's big gamut to essentially get around, this ever-present, kind of like Sofon.
Yeah. Whereas the first book, a theme was like sympathy for the devil, where you kind of develop a sympathy for the Trisolarians because of the world that they grew up in, and oh, woe is me. The second book is, yeah, but they are devils, and they are out to kill you. And Luo Ji, the main character, he has a conversation with Wenjie at some point in time after the death of Wenjie's daughter. So Wenjie's daughter was one of the scientists killed by the Trisolarians through driving them insane with these like, tiny invisible machines that tell you to kill yourself. Sorry, Susan, if that's but So in the second book, Luo Ji is kind of trying to figure out these axioms that Wenjie told him. Like the first one is like, there's I forget what the axioms are exactly, but there's something like civilization grows, but there's not infinite matter. So eventually, like there's a need to survive, but limited matter at a large enough scale. And so this will eventually produce a conflict between interstellar species. But the conflict takes place over eons, whereas war on a planet might take over a few years. Communication, the speed of light being limited, means that war takes place over the course of centuries in space, which means that the governments and powers and cultures that go to war at the start of a conflict may very well all go extinct by the end of a conflict, and people might just not know why they're fighting anymore. And so there's this idea of like how do you fight a war across multiple generations, across eons of space and time? Is it even worth it? And is there an easier solution? Maybe it's easier just to nuke the planet than to deal with people. Like you said, Luo Ji, he's this like useless academic, but for some reason, ETO wants to kill him. And the UN is like, why does this organization in contact with aliens keep killing this guy, trying to kill this guy? What? He's just this dumbass academic with no future. Why do they want to kill him? And so the UN kind of creates this project called the Wallfacer Project, based off of a Chinese philosophy where you stare at a wall in total silence and produce a world in your mind that no one else knows. It's an ancient philosophical meditation technique. And the idea is, well, we're going to take these individuals, we're going to give them all the resources that we can, and they are sworn to silence for the rest of their lives as to what their plans are. Because although the Sofons can read human technology and like disrupt things, they can't read a human mind. And so as long as it's in your mind, it's secret to the Trisolarians. And so you're going.
And so the idea is essentially that, kind of like in the Roman tradition, right? We've been presented with a time of crisis. And so the traditional democratic methods of, voting, creating a committee, well, those no longer apply. And while there is throughout the book kind of irritatingly a lot of conflict between, these kind of like super governmental organizations like the UN and our Wallfacers, who are essentially dictators, they've been given, essentially unlimited power. The idea is essentially, well, all right, like our enemies, anything we write down, anything that we transmit digitally, they can read, no matter where it is. So what we've got to do is essentially, well, we've got to put it all where they can't read it, which is in someone's head. And so 4 Wallfacers are created. Shortly afterwards, we hear that the remnants of the ETO, this organization that has been shattered, well, they've decided to create their own plan. And well, essentially this plan is called the Wallbreaker Project. And they set up one guy whose job it is to find out the plan. And the argument is essentially that, well, if I can guess their plan as a regular guy, then obviously, the Trisolarians can guess it, and everything you've done is pointless.
Well, also, the Trisolarians, of course, being a different biology, may not understand some of the intuitions of human reasoning. And so the argument is, well, if Trisolarius puts a human to try and figure out the human plan, it's more likely to succeed than an alien brain trying to figure out a completely alien mind. I kind of missed the point of the last thing. One of the reasons why the Wallfacer Project was set up is because the UN doesn't know why the Trisolarians want to kill Luo Ji, and so we'll just give him all the resources that they can get and see if he is an idea that would justify why the aliens want to kill him. And for whatever reason Luo Ji's a target, the Trisolarians won't even tell the ETO. So as far as humanity knows, both the ETO and the UN, Luo Ji's got something in his mind that they don't even like the Trisolarians don't even want ETO to know what it is. It's that secretive. What is it? Who knows? But like the Trisolarians tell the ETO, don't even bother with Luo Ji. We're monitoring him on our own.
Right. And that's an interesting idea, right? That like, well, we don't know why this guy is important, but the people who, the beings who called us bugs. And this is kind of a recurring theme that for, the Trisolarians, right? These aliens, humanity is so beneath them that they consider them insects, right? They're not even worth taking seriously. And so the moment that they actually find someone that scares them, that they need to take care of. They're trying to arrange his death. Understandably, everyone's like, oh, that guy must be important. Now, we don't know why he's important. So logic essentially goes, well, if they're scared of him, we might as well give him everything we've got.
Yeah.
And what's especially interesting is that this main character kind of, at least in this book, for the first part of it, keeps his slacker nature. He doesn't want anything to do with it. He's not a good person.
Oh, well, so, also he doesn't know either.
Yeah, he has no idea. And so he's like, okay, here's my plan. Give me a salary, not like a super exorbitant one, but like a pretty high salary. Buy me a mansion and just find me a really attractive girlfriend. And that's my plan. And they're like, well, that is your plan. We're going to do it. And so it essentially takes them around 5 years to figure out that, wait a minute, this wasn't his real plan. He just wanted us to leave him alone and give him everything he wanted anyway.
Yeah,
which is a little bit amusing.
Luo Ji is in as much as in the first book, Wenjie is a stand-in for the incel character. I would argue Luo Ji is the stand-in for the stockbro characters. Like, oh, I won the lottery, I'm just gonna go and get my tread wife and live in the woods.
And it's full of these kind of like amusing interactions where there's, this idea is like, well, you can never question them, because if you make them explain it, the cat's out of the bag. And there are multiple situations where, to kind of more and more absurd levels, someone will ask him, why are you doing that? He's like, that's part of the plan.
Let's talk about that for a second.
You need to buy this extremely expensive bottle of wine for me. I'm like, why? I mean, it's part of the plan. And the idea is it does get ridiculous. And what happens over the course of these few years, and there are 4 Wallfacers. So there's one who is, and then they're all kind of representations of different civilizations.
Yeah. And that's important to say. Like, each Wallfacer is the manifestation of their civilization. So I wrote them down in what I sent you earlier. Let me fetch them. I can do a quick summary of them.
So the first one is another stand-in American, this guy named Frederick Tyler, who essentially is kind of like a stand-in for a neocon.
Yeah.
And so he develops kind of a series of hyper militaristic plans. And it's funny, if you in our personal interactions,
Go on.
I sent you a very funny text, which is, wait a minute, is he talking to Osama bin Laden? Because essentially this guy runs out of ideas and is like, well, I need to make people fight. I need to make people do something hopeless, right? Fight this, interstellar civilization. Well, who's good at that? The guy who started the Taliban, he probably knows how to do this. So he does end up speaking to the Taliban. And relatively quickly, his Wallbreaker figures out his plan. And this causes him to go into a spiral. He basically can't handle the fact that, he, the best and the brightest, one of these kind of like extremely capable, very credentialed members of kind of like I don't know how you would say it, like the neocon class.
Well, these are the managerial elite.
Exactly. And so he, after a conversation with Luo Ji, he kills himself.
Yeah, he can't deal with it. He can't handle the fact that there isn't a managerial solution to this problem.
Right. And so our second Wallbreaker is I believe he's a fictional leader of Venezuela. His name is Manuel Rey Diaz.
Yeah.
And he's kind of the stand-in for like this kind of like third world strongman type, right? He successfully fought off, an American invasion. And he has his own plan, which essentially involves, which is kind of the solution that I was mentally running with, which is, well, all right, we'll create a Cold War II scenario. Right? We'll create mutually assured destruction. Well, if you do that, we'll essentially create an explosion so big it will damage the Earth, right? If we can't have it, no one can. And again, he ends up essentially, when this is revealed, instead of killing himself when his plan is found out, because to be honest, his plan probably would have worked. It is so abhorrent to the UN, to kind of these supranational agencies, that he's essentially kicked out of society, and just normal people mob him and stone him to death.
He's color revolutioned.
Right, exactly. Because what was needed to, at least achieve some degree of success was so abhorrent, humanity couldn't take it.
Yeah, and that's a thing where like the ideas might be right, but the time period for them isn't.
Right, exactly. That to quote an oft-used line, that people can't handle the truth. They can't do the things they need to do to survive. And
Yeah,
so,
I would argue Ray Diaz's solution is probably the closest to the ultimate solution that works, but yeah, it wasn't tolerable. The idea of like mutually assured destruction doesn't work very well with the contemporary neo progressive, like progressive liberal neocon. It might work with the neocons in part because they kind of invented the solution, but mutually assured destruction is not really tolerable to a progressive worldview where everybody can be fair and reasonable. Democracy can be pushed on everybody, and they'll go for it.
and so right after the death of DS, right, essentially Luo Ji's gamut is called. Everyone realizes that, wait a minute, his plan to just hang out with his hot wife in a cottage in the Swiss Alps is not actually a plan to save the world. And what they do is they basically are like, all right, we are kidnapping your wife and child. We are not letting you see them. We are not letting you have a normal life. We are forcing you to do this.
Yeah.
And so essentially this puts our character into crisis because he quite literally has no idea what to do. And there's an interesting series of interactions between our main character, who is this kind of like purposeless academic, and a police officer we meet in the first half. Dashur is, I think, generally how you say his name, who's kind of he's a very interesting character, but he's essentially a uneducated, grizzled police detective. It's described that he's been put on suspension multiple times for police brutality. He's got a very jaded view of the world. And so essentially our main character has absolutely no idea what to do. And this is kind of contrasted with another, the last Wallfacer, which is a British neuroscientist whose name is Bill Hines. So do you want to describe his kind of tack towards this, this like ticking clock, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, he has an interesting solution. Just AI the problem away, and so he wants to build. He thinks that if we can't break the Sofon lock, maybe the human brain can. Instead of our technology, maybe the brain can be jump started to like see in a deeper way that we can't currently see. If you could directly see the Sofons, you would know what they're influencing, right? If your eyes are precise enough to see the Sofons, you would know what data is right and what data is corrupted because you could see them working. So his idea is to somehow jumpstart human evolution to advance our biology beyond the Sofons, and this eventually ends up him seeking like what we now know as a neural net, like the AI art bots. He basically does I think this is many years before AI art bots existed, but he basically has that solution: build a neural net like organization, computer hardware network that will essentially tackle the Sofon issue for us, many multitude times more advanced than the human brain, and maybe you can eventually do that genetically with future technology. And so he and his wife, go on.
Sorry. And so why this is so interesting is because essentially what this Chinese author does is pose a problem and basically say like, all right, the different ruling castes of current society, right? The neocons, the transhumanists, and like third world dictator type strongmen. None of them have adequate solution to this problem. They cannot figure it out. And so it's interesting because in many ways it's kind of analogous to our current situation, right? Where we have kind of created a problem where technology seems to be slowing down, and none of the kind of like the three traditional 20th century ruling strategies seem up to the task.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly interesting.
I'd like to quote I quoted John Michael Greer occasionally. He's the druid I like to read sometimes, up in Connecticut, and he has this quote, come visit the grave come visit the grave Nietzsche dug for God. You might hear the grave diggers burying progress too. And it's a great line, and essentially like because the 20th century built progress as their new god, if that god fails, they're gonna go fucking nuts. They can't find anything else. They're completely crippled without their god. And so by robbing the 20th century cults of their god, he exposes them as like madmen. They're all madmen with no solutions to the problem.
Right, because in many ways we've kind of bet everything on the idea that, oh well, technology will smooth it over.
Yeah.
Technology will provide that X factor. And the problem is that, in this case, it's an explicit outside force. But as you've mentioned, no one's really explored the idea of, well, what if we figured out everything there is to know?
Yeah, and this is actually, I wanted to mention it. One of the things or questions that led me to read this book was this like thought experiment I had a few years ago, where I was like, hi, my mom, she loves Star Trek. And she'd always talk about how, oh yeah, all the inventions of Star Trek are coming true. The tricorders, the cell phone, the computers, or the laptops, all this stuff's coming true. And I started realizing, if you go back to like 1800 or like War of the Worlds era literature, they had a few inventions like spaceships and terraforming, and we kind of figured those things out to some extent into the 20th century. So 19th century literature proposes inventions, 20th century solves it. 20th century Star Trek proposes inventions, 21st century solves it. That doesn't really hold true for my generation. There aren't a lot of new inventions in sci-fi being offered. Like the distance between sci-fi and actual technology feels a lot shorter than if I was reading War of the Worlds in the year 1900. And essentially the rate of theorizing new ideas seems to be slowing down a lot compared to what we're actually inventing, to the extent that I'm kind of convinced that within my lifetime we will discover everything. Like, I can't think of any things where there might be new discoveries, maybe the Higgs field or things like that, but I'm kind of convinced I'm going to live to see the end of science at this point in my life.
So this is an interesting idea, because I do want to address that, and also I'm happy to do a part 2 with you on this
Sorry.
series, because legitimately there's a lot to discuss here, and we do need to cover the groundwork so people can at least understand where we're coming from, right? And so the only reason I want to say this is because the only main character in this entire series that I actually like is Luo Ji, because he essentially is kind of the one person who we follow that actually kind of like sees the situation for what it is. And what eventually happens is that this technology of hibernation, which appears multiple times, starts to pass more and more time in kind of the world, where our characters kind of sleep through it. And what happens is that basically Luo Ji has actually spent almost no money compared to everyone else. All the other Wallfacers have devised these grand schemes that involve trillions of dollars, and he hasn't really done anything at all. But what he has done is he's basically what he says, and this is not explained at the time, is he says, I have cast a spell.
Yeah.
and what he does is send coordinates to essentially an empty star out in the middle of nowhere, and he bounces it off the sun, much like Femcell bounced coordinates or bounced information off the sun in the first one. And what is basically calculated is that it will take 50 years for the information that those coordinates to a barren sun, a couple light years away, will take, roughly 50 years to go off into the ether. And so what he does is he enters hibernation as the last time, as our one other remaining Wallfacer also enters hibernation to wait for his essentially neural computer to develop.
So let's take a point to say the first half of the second book is essentially all the Wallfacers testing their ideas, and then they kind of all come to the conclusion we have to sleep for technology to catch up. What little room for advancing technologies left with the Sofons, we need those last little oomphs to get our ideas across. And so the two left over Wallfacers, Luo Ji and Heinz, they decide to sleep for a few decades into the future, or a century, right? They end up going a lot longer than they meant, right? You can go on that.
Well, right. And so this brings us to our first major time skip. And to me, this is in many ways something I find particularly interesting, because it basically chronicles what would human society do what does the author think that humanity's societies would do? Which brings us to another major theme in this, which is called the Ravine. And so what happens in the second book is essentially human civilization as a whole is put on a war footing, right? The idea is that we have this 400-year ticking clock, that it's getting closer and closer to the day in which this, insurmountable foe arrives and kills us all. So they make the logical choice of essentially devoting their entire economy to this. And in the intervening time, while our main characters are essentially asleep, there's kind of a miniature civilizational collapse, right? There's a massive famine. The human population shrinks dramatically. But by the time our main characters wake up, we've essentially achieved the Star Trek future.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Human material want has essentially been satisfied. Everyone lives in essentially, automated gay space communism underground, right? And everything seems to be working well. But this doesn't last. Right?
There is a very big hint when they wake up that it's not what it all seems. Well, a few hints. The first is that the Ding Yi, one of the secondary characters who wakes up, a scientist, he realizes that even though he's like 100 years in the future, he's like an astrophysicist professor, and he realizes everything he was teaching in the 21st century is still the current curriculum. And he's like, that's a little sussy. Like
that's the dumbest way to describe that, but you're not wrong.
Yeah.
And essentially what's happened is that in the intervening time, the aliens were right. Technology has not advanced. All we have done is essentially, to a smaller and smaller degree, kind of optimized what tech we already discovered. We've gotten slightly better at making electric motors. We've gotten a little bit more efficient. We've gotten a little bit better at making, new Skinner boxes. But materially, we haven't really discovered anything new. And so what eventually happens, right, is that we see, and I want to, wrap up and explain the concept of why the second book, rather, which is my favorite, is called The Dark Forest, is that we see the result of this hex, this spell, quote unquote, that our character Luo Ji sent off into space. And everyone laughs at him. When he comes back, he's not anything special. The Wallfacer Project is viewed as some like crazy Cold War thing now.
Yeah.
It's viewed as like, something we overreacted, because essentially everyone has decided, well, it's not worth sacrificing our quality of life. We saw what that did. That created this massive famine. So you know what? Let's just relax. We've advanced. We're probably fine. We've built up this fleet that we're sure can take on the Trisolarian.
Yeah. And again, this is we mentioned it before the show, but this is essentially Dunning-Kruger effect plotted onto the Star Trek future, where because humanity hasn't found anything new, they just kind of assumed, we must have just like the Sofon lock, as they call it, must not have been as effective as they thought, right? We must have solved all the problems. We have spaceships now. We have lasers. We have all the crazy cool stuff. Whatever. We can deal with the aliens now.
Right. What can they do against us? But there are several complicating factors. So first, the Trisolarians have launched another fleet. And
not yet. No.
Oh, it hasn't happened yet. Sorry, it's been a while since I've read this.
Yeah, no, they launch a probe.
Thank you for that. They launch a probe, right? Which is this tiny object, right? This minuscule, I think it's described as the size of a truck, right? The size of a semi. And it's coming to Earth very, very quickly. And so, civilization essentially sends out its entire fleet to intercept
most of it. Yeah,
almost 98% of it. Because no one can agree. If our victory is so assured that everyone wants to be a part of it, we don't want anyone to be left out of this.
Yeah. It's the utopia where every battleship gets a chance to shoot the enemy craft to prove their worth, right? So they arrange their entire the three major fleets: the North American fleet, the European fleet, the Asian Pacific fleet, arrange themselves in this vertical grid formation around the probe as it arrives in the solar system. And the idea is that they're going to try and see if it's a messenger of peace. Oh, maybe the Trisolarians see we've advanced. Now we can be friends because we're at an equal footing. Or if it's some kind of weapon, we'll just blow it up and give them a good show for their money. And so the fleet essentially approaches very close quarters in a vertical grid, and sends out Ding Yi, the scientist I mentioned before, who by the way is in the prequel before the trilogy. Ding Yi, who's really like, this ain't gonna end well for us. He's a real cynic, and so he advises as many ships as he can in the fleet. Listen, get yourself ready to get the fuck out of here if anything goes wrong. Like, be ready to just hit the gas on the pedal, get out. And his advice essentially, like a few ships put themselves in what's known as a deep sea state, which is like they have to put the crew under high pressure hibernation to accelerate, otherwise they'll kill everyone. Like the acceleration fluid, like in a deep sea ocean state. And so Dinghy and his little crew goes to evaluate the probe, and they discover it's a seamless droplet, like a water droplet, perfectly reflective, and seems to be at like 0 Kelvin, like absolute zero. And Dinghy kind of quickly realizes this is the product of technology we do not have access to. And so he's kind of like, he's an old man. He's like, I'm gonna die one day anyway. Whatever. I'll do this thing for you, but I got a bad feeling about this. And as he gets the molecular scanners onto the probe, he starts realizing he can't see any chemistry of it. It's a solid surface where the neutrons of whatever it's made of are so tightly packed you can't even see the distances between atomic nuclei. And he instantly realizes this thing is
we're over.
We're dead. We're dead.
We're not. What proceeds to happen is that this massive, Spanish Armada like fleet, the entire might of humanity, with essentially 3 exceptions, is destroyed in a matter of hours, just completely obliterated, almost to a man.
The ship turns out to be made of what's known as a strong force, which is like a known physical thing that we don't yet know how to explain. The strong force is what holds atoms together. It's 100 times stronger than any chemical force, I think, or something like that. And so this little probe, because it has Sofons, it knows where every ship is, it knows where all of their fusion cores are, and it proceeds to essentially ram all of the ships through their fusion core, blowing them all up in like a giant, like 1-by-1 domino explosion.
Right. And so essentially what happens is with a few notable exceptions, because there are essentially 2 groups of ships that manage to escape.
Yeah, they listen to Dinghy. They listen to Dinghy.
Right, and they escape. And what's interesting is after that, this probe essentially disappears again. We cannot find it. And so these 2 different groups of ships essentially head off into deep space. The idea is they are going to just get out. They'll leave and never come back. But
go on. Sorry.
What's especially interesting is that we're kind of treated to this dilemma, between, the ship's crew, where everyone has kind of realized that no one out of these 2 different groups of ships, I think there's 3 in one and 2 in the other, are going to make it with 3 different ships. They're all going to need all of the resources.
Yeah.
They can't make it. And there's this kind of like diabolical game theory situation where everyone doesn't want to wipe anyone out, but they all know they need to. And what's essentially called, I believe, what is the term they call it in the book?
The Battle of Darkness.
The Battle of Darkness, where essentially we see how humanity acts in kind of like ultimate desperation, right? Outside of Earth itself. And the answer to that is pure rational, like pure cold-hearted murder, right? You have to kill to survive. And so what happens is both of these groups realize the exact same thing and turn on each other almost instantaneously. Outside of certain.
Once they're beyond the return, like once they realize there's not enough fuel to go back and there's not enough fuel to go anywhere, and they're kind of stuck, they realize that it's in this cosmos, it's kill or be killed, even against your own. Some have to die so all can live.
And so this is a theme that comes out through the book, right? The kind of like, and this is the sociology of space. And we're coming up on, kind of the end of the show. Yeah. And I want you guys to come back. I want you guys to read this book because it's well worth your time. And I want to reveal next time how this ties into how Luo Ji, our main character of the second book, essentially cracks the problem, how he figures it out.
Do we want to mention what happens at this point? Well, he's like waking up after the darkness battle is happening, or do we want to say it for next time?
Do you think that's giving away too much? You can if you want.
I think saying no. It's well, we'll say it this much. The Luo Ji he never wakes up from the time he asked. They kind of forgot about him. And so he actually ends up sleeping not for like 50 years for the time for his spell to get to the other solar system. He ends up sleeping for like a century, basically, like a lot more longer than he thought. And of course, his wife and children are also hibernating. And the UN just forgets about him. And when he wakes up, they only wake him up because of the battle, both the battle with the droplet and the battle of darkness that precedes, where Earth once again is in this state of panic. The Dunning-Kruger effect. We were not as good as we thought. We are fucked. How do we fix this?
The massive fleet we built to defend humanity was destroyed by a probe, by a single probe.
Not even a ship.
And they launched more than one. I believe there are 11 of them.
Yeah.
And so essentially we are right back where we started. We have wasted 100 years of time.
200 years.
200 years, right. 200 years of time. We're halfway there. And we are right back where we started.
Yeah.
And so that's where our main character is essentially brought back. So, basically we've gone back to square one. And if you want to hear how this is resolved, come back for next time, because I want to talk about this. This book, in addition to just being an interesting story, has a lot to say about, like we've said before, about the relationship between men and women, the relationship between cultures, and human nature. Right? I consider it the only good sci-fi book written after the Cold War. So that gets a full, kind of, I guess, recommend from me.
I'll only say this much: his spell works, but we're not going to reveal how it worked until next time.
Well, fair enough. So we have some super chats that I want to get through.
Yeah.
Falling outside the normal moral constraints. We need a Dan Simmons Hyperion Canto stream. That sounds interesting. I'll look into that. Also, an Ian M. Banks Culture series stream. I'd be up for that. Restoring Order, Patrick Casey, whose show I will be appearing on soon. You guys should check us out. I believe that will be the 17th. Good discussion. Read any Gene Wolfe? I've owned Shadow of the Torturer for a while, but I haven't read it. I actually have read Gene Wolfe and actually talked about it last night in my conversation with actually I think it was Monday with my conversation with Lambda. That's a book that's incredibly influential on me. I would recommend reading Gene Wolfe. He has a very different take on sci-fi. It is really only technically sci-fi. It is kind of a story of a humanity who has fallen so far that they don't understand the world that they inhabit anymore. They're so different from kind of humanity at their peak that they essentially have returned to a world of magic. And I think that's quite interesting. It's worth your time. It's kind of, feudalism in space, but in not a gay way. So Gene Wolfe is honestly, I hate to say it, Gene Wolfe is probably my favorite science fiction writer. And then Corbin just sends $5, very kind. Smear for $5 Australian. Back in systems engineering, we studied some theoretical Chinese fire escape plans. The Bugmen literally use false exits to decongest real exits. Jeez, that's grim. Wow. I will say, and I don't mean to to be too punitive about this, but I did come out of this book with both a respect and a disdain for Chinese culture.
There's a lot of the Bugmen are out again in this book.
Yeah, 100%. Where it's like it's interesting because it's not like a lot of modern fiction where it's like, Chinese culture is like American culture with wontons. It's like, oh no, these are different types of people and they do some things right. And you could not pay me to be Chinese. I'll put it that way.
I just wanted to say, Restoring Order, I really liked your show today. The 10th episode was really nice.
I listened to about half of it. I'll catch up to the rest of it tomorrow, but it was great. Turnip's a good friend of mine, and Patrick is his interview show is lights out. So you guys should check that out. And anyway, we're definitely gonna head back for a part 2, Luthemplar. I enjoy talking to you. Obviously, half of our call-in streams turn out to be an hour with me and 8 other people, and then 2 hours with me and you talking.
Yeah.
I could basically talk to you forever. But anyway, man, do you want to tell everyone where they can find you?
Yeah, I have a Twitter at the same at as what you see on the screen, where I stir shit essentially. That's about it. And then I go to I Substack. I write Substack at luthnight.substack.com, where I some totally random topics that just come to mind sometimes. People seem to like it, so I like to write sometimes. And of course, the Restoration Bureau, which is a fun little art project I will continue trying to motivate you right-wing folk to stop being incels that's stuck in your basement. Go out and be men, for goodness sake.
So basically, what you're telling me is you're the Shinzo Abe of the E-right. You know,
I'm
desperately
trying to
pleading
be.
with
I'm
us
trying
to
to
have
be.
sex.
Yes, essentially, the Restoration Bureau is go outside, touch grass, have sex, get married, have kids, stop bitching.
And that's the kind of message that we promote on the Jay Burden Show, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, guys, all of Luthemplar's links will be down in the description. My stuff, obviously, you can find my links in the same place. We were doing some changes. The new look for the Jay Burden Show should be premiering very soon. I've been in talks with my graphic designer to pick a new look for the show. We're going to be increasing the level of production because I really enjoy this and I want to show you guys they do take this seriously, and I want it to look good because you guys have offered a lot of support. And part of that is that the monetization of this show is changing. No longer will my old episodes be gated behind a paywall. Everything's always going to be up there. But if you do want to support us, we really appreciate that. And any way you want to do it, we'll take it. You can find all the links below for either a one-time or recurring on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, whatever you want. You can find me there. And again, I don't expect it, but I do appreciate it. And definitely keep your eye out for part 2 on this one, guys. And remember, keep your head up, guys. The lie can't last forever. Good night.